I was 3 feet away, holding a clipboard I wasn't even really using, when I heard my own daughter-in-law describe me to a coworker as cheap, out of touch, and, her exact words, some old man who's never worked a real shift in his life. I want to tell you, before anything else, that she wasn't entirely wrong about the situation she was describing. She was just completely wrong about who was actually responsible for it. And the 4 minutes that followed that conversation are going to matter a lot more to this story than you're expecting right now. My name is Walter Bishop. I'm 60 years old, and I own 12 Italian restaurants across North Carolina under the name Renata's, a chain I built from a single location in Winston-Salem starting 31 years ago, back when I was a 29-year-old line cook with a business plan nobody believed in and a wife, Renata, who believed in it. I want you to hold onto her name, because it matters more to this story than you'd guess from one sentence. I started that first location with a loan I nearly didn't qualify for, co-signed by Renata's father, a man who told me at the closing table that he was betting on his daughter's judgment about me more than on my actual business plan, which he'd read twice and still had real doubts about. He wasn't entirely wrong to have doubts. The first 18 months nearly broke us. A burst pipe that flooded the kitchen 4 months in. A health inspector who nearly shut us down over a violation that turned out to be a paperwork error, but cost us 2 terrifying weeks of uncertainty before it was resolved. A summer where Renata and I both went without paying ourselves for 11 straight weeks just to make payroll for our 6 employees. I tell you all of this because I think it matters for understanding exactly how much that single location meant to both of us, and how carefully, deliberately, we built every location that followed it. Here's the part most people don't know, including, until 11 days before that walk-in cooler conversation, my own daughter-in-law Danielle. I don't run Renata's under my own name. Every location operates under a holding company called Meridian Hospitality Partners. Every piece of paperwork any employee ever sees lists a regional VP as the point of contact, and I personally have not been introduced to a single new hire at any of my 12 locations as the owner in over 15 years. There's a reason for that. It's not a small reason. And I'm going to tell you exactly what it is, but not yet, because you need to understand what was actually happening inside that restaurant before that reason is going to make any sense at all. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and I promise you this one has more turns in it than you're expecting. Now let's get back to it. Danielle married my son Ethan 2 years ago, and I want to be honest that I liked her from the very first dinner I ever had with the two of them. A sharp, funny, hard-working 28-year-old who managed the front of house at a restaurant in Cary, North Carolina, a job she'd held for almost 3 years by the time she and Ethan even started dating. Ethan doesn't work in the family business. He teaches high school chemistry, a career choice I've never once pressured him to reconsider. And because he's never worked at Renata's, and because Danielle had that job entirely on her own before she ever met him, nobody in our family ever had occasion to sit down and specifically explain to her which company actually owned the restaurant chain she worked for. I want to describe how Ethan and Danielle actually met, because it explains a lot about why this particular gap in her knowledge managed to persist for so long. They were introduced through a mutual friend at a birthday party, well outside any restaurant context entirely, and Ethan, when the subject of Danielle's job came up early in their dating, simply said something like, "Oh, my family's in restaurants too," a specific, casual vagueness that neither of them thought to press further, because neither of them had any particular reason to think the connection mattered. Ethan himself, I should say, has never been especially interested in the operational details of Renata's. He grew up watching me run it, respects it enormously, but built his own career entirely separate from it, and honestly couldn't have told you without checking exactly which corporate name appeared on his own father's paperwork. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds almost impossible that a woman could work somewhere for 3 years, marry into the family that owns it, and still not know. I'm going to explain exactly how that happened, and I promise you the explanation is stranger than you're picturing right now. But first, you need to understand what Danielle actually believed about her job, because everything she said in that walk-in cooler makes a very different kind of sense once you understand what she thought was true. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next part is where this story stops being simple. Danielle believed, the same as every single one of her coworkers, that Renata's Cary location was managed under a corporate structure run by a regional operations director named Curtis Vance, a man who had held that specific role for 6 years, who visited the Cary location roughly twice a month, and who was, according to every single employee I eventually interviewed, the single most consistent source of frustration in that restaurant's day-to-day operation. Curtis denied budgets. Curtis, as far as Danielle and her entire staff understood, was the final word on every decision that mattered. A man who reported, they believed, directly to corporate, a vague, distant entity nobody had ever met, and that everybody, Danielle included, had started referring to informally as the owner. Here's what you need to understand about the 11 days before that walk-in cooler conversation, because I think this is the part of the story most people skip past too quickly. Danielle had submitted, 6 weeks earlier, a detailed request for a new point-of-sale system to replace equipment that was, by that point, malfunctioning multiple times a shift, alongside a proposed raise structure for her 3 longest-tenured servers, all of whom had gone without a real increase in over. Curtis Vance had denied both requests, in writing, citing what he called budget constraints imposed by ownership. I want you to remember that exact phrase, budget constraints imposed by ownership. It's going to matter enormously in about 10 minutes. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I found out about the denied requests entirely by accident, the way I find out about almost everything that actually matters inside my restaurants. Not through Curtis Vance's monthly reports, which had, for years, been polished, confident, and, as I would eventually learn, quietly dishonest in ways I hadn't caught yet, but through a habit I've kept for 31 years and have never once told my regional managers about. Twice a month, unannounced, dressed in plain clothes, carrying nothing more official looking than a clipboard and a folder, I visit one of my 12 locations myself, introducing myself, when anyone asks, as Walt, doing a corporate compliance check. Nobody at floor level has ever once connected that name to the ownership of the company. Why would they? There are 11 other men named Walter in the Meridian Hospitality Partners employee directory alone. I started this specific practice about a year after Renata's passing, partly because it kept me connected to the actual, physical texture of the business we'd built together, and partly because I'd noticed, in the years right after her death when I was grieving and considerably less attentive than usual, that a couple of my regional reports had started sounding just a little too uniformly positive, a little too polished, in a way that made me suspicious even before I had any specific evidence of a problem. I want to be honest that most of these unannounced visits turn up nothing more dramatic than a walk-in cooler running a few degrees warmer than it should, or a schedule that needs adjusting. Most months, they are genuinely uneventful. That particular Tuesday in March was not going to be one of those months. I walked into the Cary location on a Tuesday afternoon in March, during the slow window between lunch and dinner service. The exact kind of quiet stretch where you actually learn something real about how a restaurant runs, because nobody's performing for a rush. I did my usual walkthrough: kitchen, walk-in coolers, dry storage, the small back office where the weekly schedules get posted. And it was in that walk-in cooler, checking temperature logs that I had absolutely no reason to be suspicious of yet, that I heard Danielle's voice on the other side of the heavy plastic curtain strips, talking to a server named Priya about the denied equipment request. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. "I don't even understand what we're supposed to do," Danielle was saying, her voice carrying the specific, exhausted frustration of someone who'd clearly had this exact conversation with herself more than once already. "The POS system freezes at least twice a shift. Marco can't run a dinner rush on a system that crashes during the ticking queue. And Curtis says it's budget constraints from ownership. Like, what does that even mean? Some cheap old man sitting in an office somewhere who's never worked a real shift in his life gets to decide my servers don't deserve a raise after 2 years. It's insane. This whole place runs because we make it run, not because of whatever ancient guy is supposedly signing off on budgets from some office we've never even seen." I want to describe exactly what happened in my body when I heard that sentence, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I did not feel angry. I felt something considerably more complicated. A specific, sinking recognition that the version of me Danielle had just described, cheap, distant, indifferent to the people actually running my restaurants, was not a version of me I recognized at all. And that meant something else entirely was going on, something I hadn't caught yet, something that had let a fictional, miserly version of me take root in the mind of every single employee at one of my own 12 restaurants. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what I did in the next 4 minutes is not what you're expecting. I did not push through that plastic curtain and announce myself. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's the single most important decision in this entire story. And I made it in about 6 seconds, standing 3 feet away with a clipboard in my hand. I understood, in that moment, that walking in and correcting Danielle right then would accomplish exactly nothing except embarrassing her and shutting down the one genuinely honest conversation I'd overheard in months. What I actually needed to understand wasn't whether Danielle resented me. What I needed to understand was where the phrase "budget constraints imposed by ownership" had actually come from, because I had never once, in 6 years, imposed a single budget constraint on the Cary location, and I keep detailed records of every location's approved capital expenditure requests personally. I want to walk you through those 6 seconds as honestly as I can, because I've replayed them more times than almost any other moment in this entire story. My first instinct, genuinely, was to step through that curtain, laugh it off, tell her who I actually was, and reassure her that whatever budget problem she was describing had to be some kind of misunderstanding I'd sort out immediately. My second instinct, arriving almost immediately behind the first, was a specific, uncomfortable recognition that if I did that, I would never actually find out what had really happened, because Danielle, mortified and backtracking, would immediately start softening everything she just said, and Priya would do the same, and I would walk away with a polished, careful version of the truth instead of the real one I'd just been fortunate enough to overhear by pure accident. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I backed quietly out of that walk-in cooler, through a side exit Danielle and Priya couldn't see, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I did anything at all, running through 6 years of Curtis Vance's monthly reports in my head. Reports I had, I want to be honest, been reading a little too quickly for a little too long, trusting a man whose numbers had always looked clean enough that I'd never once had reason to dig deeper. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think, and we're nowhere near the end of this one. I called my accountant, a careful, methodical woman named Sandra Okonkwo, who has handled Meridian Hospitality Partners books for 9 years, the following morning, and asked her to pull every capital expenditure request and denial from the Cary location going back 3 years, cross-referenced against the actual approved corporate budget I had personally signed off on for that same period. I told her I wanted it within the week. Sandra has a particular way of asking follow-up questions that I've come to genuinely appreciate over the 9 years she's worked with me. A specific unwillingness to proceed on assumptions before she understands exactly what she's actually looking for. She asked me on that first call whether I suspected a specific problem or simply wanted a routine audit. And I remember being honest with her that I didn't yet know which one it was, only that something about a phrase I'd overheard didn't match anything I'd personally approved, and that I needed the actual numbers before I could tell her anything more specific than that. She called me back in 4 days, and I want to describe what it felt like reading the document she sent, because it changed the entire shape of this story from something simple into something I genuinely hadn't anticipated standing in that parking lot. Over the preceding 3 years, Curtis Vance had denied on paper, citing ownership-imposed budget constraints, 14 separate capital and payroll requests from the Cary location alone, totaling just under 9. My actual approved budget for that location over the same 3-year period had never once been reduced. In fact, I had personally increased it twice, specifically to account for inflation and staff retention, exactly the kind of increases that should have funded a new POS system and a round of raises with room to spare. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going. $91,000 is not a small number. And I want to be honest that my first, immediate assumption was that Curtis was simply padding a different location's budget, moving money around within the region in some kind of internal reallocation I hadn't been informed about. A genuinely bad practice, but a considerably less serious one than what I would eventually learn was actually happening. Sandra's second pass through the numbers over the following 10 days ruled that theory out entirely. The $91,000 didn't show up anywhere else in the region's books. It had simply vanished, routed, Sandra eventually traced, through a vendor account for equipment maintenance and facilities consulting that had been set up 4 years earlier, paid out to an LLC that, when Sandra ran a business registration search, turned out to be owned by Curtis Vance's brother. I remember the specific, sick clarity of that phone call with Sandra, sitting in my home office with the business registration document open on my screen, reading the LLC's registered agent name twice before I fully believed what I was looking at. Sandra, characteristically careful, told me she didn't want to jump to conclusions based on a shared last name alone, that family members sometimes do have legitimate business relationships, and that we needed to actually trace what services, if any, this equipment maintenance and facilities consulting LLC had ever genuinely provided before we could be certain what we were looking at. That verification took another 5 days, and it confirmed exactly what both of us had already started to suspect. The LLC had never performed a single documented service at any Renata's location. Every invoice was for vague, unverifiable work, facilities assessment, equipment consultation, with no corresponding work orders, no maintenance logs, nothing except a monthly payment that had been quietly bleeding money out of budgets that should have gone toward exactly the things Danielle had been requesting. I want to describe the specific texture of those 5 days, waiting for Sandra's verification, because they were some of the more difficult days of this entire process for me personally. Sitting with a strong suspicion, I couldn't yet fully confirm, unable to say anything to anyone in my own family, watching Danielle at a distance during that stretch without being able to explain why I suddenly seemed so preoccupied whenever her name came up at dinner. Ethan asked me twice that week whether something was bothering me, and both times I told him I was just dealing with a work matter, which was true in the narrowest possible sense and left out almost everything that actually mattered. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want you to sit with that for a second because I certainly had to. My regional operations director had spent 3 years telling my daughter-in-law's entire restaurant that the owner was too cheap to fund basic equipment and fare raises, while quietly funneling that exact denied money into a shell company controlled by his own brother-in-law. Danielle wasn't wrong to be angry. She was angry at a fictional version of me that Curtis Vance had built specifically to cover his own theft. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I spent the following 3 weeks doing something I had genuinely never done before in 31 years of running Renata's. A full forensic review of every location under Curtis Vance's regional oversight, working with Sandra, and eventually, a fraud investigator she recommended named Marcus Chen, a careful, patient man who had spent 15 years specializing in exactly this kind of internal embezzlement case. What we found over those 3 weeks extended considerably further than the Cary location alone. Curtis had been running some version of the same scheme across 4 of his 7 locations, siphoning a combined total just under $240,000 over 4 years, consistently blaming denied requests on ownership. A phrase I now understood he'd used so specifically and so often precisely, because he knew none of his staff had ever actually met me and had no way to verify or dispute it. I want to describe what it felt like, reading Marcus Chen's final report, understanding that a man I had trusted with regional authority over 7 of my restaurants had spent 4 years quietly building a fictional version of me, cheap, distant, indifferent, specifically because that fiction was the perfect cover for exactly what he was doing. Every angry conversation Danielle and her coworkers had ever had about the cheap old owner was, in a very real sense, Curtis Vance's alibi, constructed one denied request at a time. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Here's where I need to go back and actually explain the thing I promised you 11 minutes ago. Why, exactly, I've spent 15 years making sure almost none of my own employees know I'm the actual owner of the restaurants they work in. It has everything to do with Renata, my late wife, who passed away 9 years ago, and a specific conversation we had in the 2nd year of running our very first location, back when I was still young enough and proud enough to want every employee in that building to know exactly whose name was on the deed. Renata told me that year, watching me correct a line cook a little too sharply during a Friday dinner rush, that she'd noticed something happening to the way our staff treated me the moment they learned I was the owner, rather than just Walt who works here. A specific, subtle deference that made people less honest with me, less willing to tell me when something wasn't working, more inclined to tell me what they thought an owner wanted to hear rather than the truth about what was actually happening on their shift. She told me that if I ever wanted to actually know how my restaurants were really running, I was going to have to make sure most of the people working in them never fully understood who I was. I didn't fully believe her at the time. I believe her completely now, and I've run every location I've opened since her death exactly the way she suggested, because it turns out to be the only reliable way I've found to hear the truth instead of a performance. She gave me a specific example, that same conversation, that I've never forgotten. A dishwasher at our first location, a 19-year-old kid named Terrence, had told Renata directly, thinking she was simply the manager's wife rather than a co-owner, that our dish machine's water temperature gauge had been reading inaccurately for weeks, a problem nobody had reported to me because, Renata suspected, the previous manager hadn't wanted to be the one to deliver bad equipment news to the boss. That gauge, left unaddressed, could have created a real health code problem eventually. Terrence told Renata because he didn't know he was talking to ownership. He might never have told me directly, precisely because I was. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to be honest that this same system, the one Renata designed specifically to protect the truth, is the exact system that let Curtis Vance's fiction about me survive undetected for 4 years, and I've had to sit with that particular irony for a long time since. The anonymity that let me overhear Danielle's honest, unguarded frustration in that walk-in cooler is the same anonymity that let Curtis build an entire false narrative about my supposed cheapness, with nobody ever positioned to correct it. I don't think that means the system was wrong. I think it means I got complacent about checking the numbers behind it, trusting reports for too long instead of digging as deeply as I dug that particular March. Marcus Chen's investigation concluded in early May, roughly 7 weeks after I'd stood in that parking lot outside the Cary location. And I want to describe the specific, difficult decisions that followed, because I don't think this story is honest if I skip past them. We turned the full forensic report over to law enforcement, resulting in Curtis Vance's arrest on multiple counts of embezzlement and wire fraud 6 weeks later, a case that is still, as of this telling, working its way through the court system. I terminated his employment immediately upon confirming the fraud, along with 2 regional coordinators who, Marcus's investigation determined, had known about at least part of the scheme and stayed quiet in exchange for their own smaller, separate payouts. The 2 coordinators, I want to be clear, were involved to a considerably lesser degree than Curtis himself, and I made the decision, after consulting with both Sandra and my own attorney, not to pursue criminal charges against either of them, given that the amounts involved were comparatively small, and both cooperated fully and immediately once confronted with the evidence. One of them, a woman who'd worked for the company for 11 years, wrote me a letter I still have, describing the specific, gradual way Curtis had drawn her in small favors at first, framed as harmless, escalating slowly enough that she told me she genuinely hadn't recognized how far she'd already gone until it was too late to easily extract herself. I don't offer that as an excuse for her choices. I offer it because I think it's a genuinely useful illustration of exactly how these schemes tend to work, pulling people in gradually rather than all at once, which is part of why they're so hard to catch early. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I want to describe the specific afternoon I confronted Curtis directly, before law enforcement got involved, sitting across a conference table from a man I'd promoted personally 6 years earlier, watching him move through a rapid, familiar sequence of denial, deflection, and finally a kind of resigned, quiet confession once Sandra laid the full paper trail in front of him. He didn't offer much of an explanation beyond a vague reference to financial pressure from a divorce 2 years earlier, a circumstance I understand created genuine hardship for him, but that obviously doesn't come close to justifying what he did to the employees who trusted him, Danielle included, for 4 straight years. I remember him asking, near the end of that conversation, whether I was going to tell his current staff the truth about why he was leaving, and I told him, honestly, that I intended to tell every single person he'd lied to exactly what had actually happened, because they deserved that considerably more than he deserved my discretion. I want to be honest that hiring Curtis in the first place had felt, at the time, like one of the better decisions I'd made in years, a specific irony I've had to sit with considerably since his arrest. He'd come to Renata's from a competing restaurant group with genuinely strong references, a track record of turning around 2 underperforming locations elsewhere, and an interview style that struck me at the time as refreshingly direct and confident. I promoted him to Regional Operations Director within 18 months, faster than almost anyone else in the company's history, specifically because his early reports were so consistently strong. Looking back, with everything I now understand about how carefully he'd constructed his numbers, I think that early confidence I placed in him is exactly what let his eventual scheme go undetected for as long as it did. I trusted his reports precisely because I trusted my own initial judgment about hiring him, and that trust made me considerably less rigorous about verifying his numbers than I should have been. The specific mechanics of how he'd built the scheme, which Marcus Chen eventually laid out for me in painstaking detail, involved a pattern considerably more sophisticated than I'd initially assumed. Curtis hadn't simply invented a single shell company and funneled money through it carelessly. He'd built a rotating structure of 3 separate vendor accounts over 4 years, each one active for 12 to 18 months before he'd quietly wind it down and stand up a new one. A specific pattern designed, Marcus explained, to avoid the kind of red flags that a single long-running suspicious vendor relationship might eventually trigger in a routine audit. It was, in its own dark way, a genuinely careful piece of financial engineering, which made me feel simultaneously more and less forgiving of him. More, because it clearly took real, sustained effort rather than a single impulsive decision, and less, for exactly the same reason. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button because this one isn't finished yet. But I still hadn't talked to Danielle. I want to be honest that I put that particular conversation off longer than I probably should have, partly because I genuinely didn't know how to have it, and partly, if I'm being fully honest with you, because some part of me was afraid of what she'd actually say once she understood who'd been standing on the other side of that plastic curtain. I finally called her on a Sunday evening in late May and asked whether she and Ethan would come to dinner at my house that week, alone, without any explanation of why. I spent the 2 days before that dinner rehearsing, more than I want to admit, exactly how I was going to open the conversation, running through several different versions in my head, none of which felt quite right until I finally settled on the simplest one, telling the truth in the plainest possible order, without softening it or building up to it too elaborately. I set the table myself that evening, something I don't usually bother with, and I remember standing in my own kitchen right before they arrived, feeling a specific nervousness I hadn't expected, given that I was the one holding all the information and none of the actual wrongdoing. She arrived that Thursday looking, understandably, a little nervous, the specific wariness of someone who's been summoned to a conversation she doesn't have context for. Ethan sat beside her, equally uncertain, and I want to describe exactly how I chose to open that conversation, because I think the specific approach mattered enormously for how the rest of the evening unfolded. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you. I need to tell you something, I said, sitting across the table from both of them. And I need you to let me get all the way through it before you say anything, because it's going to be uncomfortable. And I promise you it gets considerably better by the end. I told Danielle plainly that I owned Renata's all 12 locations, including the Cary restaurant where she'd worked for 3 years before ever meeting my son. I watched her face go through a specific, rapid sequence of expressions, confusion, then a kind of dawning horror as she started doing the math on every conversation she'd ever had at work. And I want you to imagine, for a second, what was going through her head in that exact moment, because I think it's worth sitting with before I tell you what actually happened next. I told her about the walk-in cooler. I told her I'd heard every word. Danielle went completely silent for what felt like a very long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Oh my God," she said. "Walter, I am so sorry. I would never have said any of that if I'd known. I feel sick. You must think I'm horrible." Ethan, beside her, had gone through his own visible progression of reactions throughout my explanation, and I want to describe what he said next, because I think it mattered enormously to Danielle in that moment. "Dad," he said, "why didn't you just tell her who you actually were the day you heard her? Why did you let this go on for 7 weeks before saying anything?" It was a fair question, one I'd anticipated, and I explained to both of them the same reasoning I've already walked you through, that revealing myself immediately would have shut down the honest conversation before I understood what was actually driving it, and that if I'd simply corrected the record without investigating further, Curtis Vance might still be sitting in his office right now, quietly continuing exactly the same scheme. Danielle asked me, at that point, a question I hadn't fully prepared for. "Did you ever think, even for a second, that maybe I was just being ungrateful? Like, complaining about a job that was actually fine, just because I didn't understand how good I had it?" I told her, honestly, no, not for a single second, because everything she described that day in the walk-in cooler had turned out to be completely accurate. The equipment really was failing. The raises really had been denied for 2 years running. Her anger had been earned, every bit of it, by real, documented failures in how that location was being run. The only thing wrong in her account was who she'd blamed for it, and that mistake, I told her, had never once been hers to make, given how carefully Curtis had constructed the story specifically to make sure nobody could trace it back to him. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going. "I don't think you're horrible at all," I told her, and I meant it completely. "I think you were angry at a version of me that was never actually real, built by a man who was stealing from my company and needed somewhere to hide the blame." Danielle, everything you said that day about the equipment, about the raises, you were right about all of it. You just had the wrong villain. I told her then about Curtis Vance, about the $91,000 siphoned from her own location alone, about the 4-year scheme that had made the cheap old owner into a convenient fiction covering an actual crime. I want to describe what it felt like watching Danielle's face shift again, from horror into something closer to a stunned, furious clarity, understanding that her genuine grievances had been real, valid, and completely justified the entire time, just aimed at the wrong target by design, by a man who'd built his entire scheme around the fact that nobody at floor level would ever be positioned to know the difference. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I offered Danielle the newly vacant regional operations position that same evening, a job, I want to be clear, I did not offer out of guilt or obligation, but because Marcus Chen's investigation had, alongside everything else, surfaced something I hadn't expected: detailed notes Danielle had kept over 3 years, meticulously documenting every denied request, every equipment failure, every specific staffing gap Curtis had refused to address. Notes she'd kept, she told, in case I ever needed to prove I'd actually tried. Those notes turned out to be some of the most useful documentation in the entire fraud investigation, a level of careful, organized diligence that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly what kind of regional operator she was going to make. I want to describe Danielle's specific reaction to that offer, because it wasn't the immediate, grateful acceptance you might expect. She actually asked for 2 weeks to think about it, telling me directly that she wanted to make sure she was taking the job because she genuinely wanted it and believed in her own ability to do it well, not simply out of some obligation to smooth things over after the walk-in cooler incident. I respected that considerably more than an immediate yes would have earned from me. Ethan told me, privately, a few days later, that he'd never seen Danielle work through a decision so carefully, staying up late several nights running her own numbers on what the role would actually require, talking to 2 other regional operators in the company to understand the job's real demands before committing to anything. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. She accepted the position 6 weeks later, after finishing out a transition period at the Cary location herself, and I want to describe what her first 90 days in that new role actually looked like, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most. She approved the new POS system for Cary within her first 2 weeks. She built out a genuine, transparent raise structure across all 7 locations Curtis had previously overseen, one she presented to every staff member personally, in person, explaining exactly how the numbers worked and where the money was actually coming from. I want to describe one specific meeting from those first 90 days that Danielle told me about herself, months later, because I think it captures something important about how she approached the role. She held her first all-staff meeting at the Cary location on a Monday morning before opening, gathering everyone who could make it, and opened, not with any kind of triumphant announcement, but by acknowledging directly, in front of the entire staff, that she understood exactly how frustrated they'd all been for years, that their frustration had been completely justified, and that she was going to spend her first year in the role rebuilding a level of financial transparency that meant nobody would ever again have to guess what ownership actually wanted or was willing to fund. Priya, the coworker who'd been in that walk-in cooler with her on the day everything changed, told me later that it was the first time in 6 years anyone in a position of real authority had actually apologized to the staff for what they'd been through, rather than simply moving on to new policies without acknowledging the damage the old ones had caused. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe one of those quarterly open floor meetings myself, because I attended the first one quietly in the back of the room, without announcing who I was to the newer staff who joined since Curtis's departure. Danielle stood at the front of a packed dining room before opening hours, taking direct questions about specific budget line items, walking a nervous new server through exactly how a proposed raise structure got calculated, answering a pointed question from a longtime cook about why a particular piece of kitchen equipment hadn't been replaced, yet with a straightforward explanation of the actual capital expenditure timeline, rather than a vague deflection. I sat in the back of that room and thought about Renata, about that dishwasher Terrence and his malfunctioning gauge, about how completely different this specific kind of transparency was from the anonymous distance I'd spent 15 years protecting, and about how Danielle had somehow found a version of honesty that didn't require anyone to be in disguise at all. A young server I didn't recognize turned to the person next to her, near the end of that meeting, and asked, quietly, who the older man in the back was. I heard the answer, delivered without any particular weight. "Oh, that's just Walt. He does compliance visits sometimes." And I want to be honest that I smiled at that, sitting there, understanding that some version of the system Renata designed all those years ago was still working exactly as intended, even now, even after everything Curtis had managed to build on top of it. The difference this time was that the woman running that meeting had made sure nobody in that room would ever again have to guess at the truth behind a closed office door. She'd simply decided to tell them herself. I didn't know, sitting across that dinner table watching Danielle absorb everything I'd told her, that within a year she was going to become one of the most respected operators in the entire Meridian Hospitality Partners organization, that staff turnover across her 7 locations would drop by nearly 40% within 18 months, or that she'd eventually implement a policy, entirely her own idea, requiring every regional operator to hold quarterly open-floor meetings where staff could ask direct questions about budget decisions, specifically designed so that no employee ever again would have to build a fictional villain out of an absent, unaccountable ownership. I also didn't know, that Thursday evening, just how much further the Curtis Vance situation was still going to unravel, that the 2 additional locations his fraud eventually touched were going to belong to an entirely different regional structure I hadn't yet thought to audit, or that a second, considerably more senior employee was going to reach out to Marcus Chen's investigative team 3 months later, with information that suggested the scheme went even deeper into the company than any of us had understood at that dinner table. I also didn't know that the 3rd vendor account Curtis had cycled through, the one Marcus Chen's team hadn't fully closed out their investigation of by the time of his arrest, was going to lead investigators to a name I genuinely hadn't expected to see connected to any of this. A former Renata's employee who'd left the company 3 years earlier under circumstances that, at the time, had seemed like an entirely unrelated resignation, but that Marcus's team was, in a follow-up report 6 months later, as worth a considerably closer look. But that's a story for next time. The truest thing I can tell you, over a year removed from that afternoon in the walk-in cooler, is that the anonymity I've spent 15 years protecting taught me something I didn't fully understand until Curtis Vance nearly weaponized it against my own family. Hearing the unguarded truth from your employees is only valuable if you're also willing to dig deep enough, often enough, to make sure the truth they're telling you is actually about you, and not about a fiction someone else has built in your name. Danielle wasn't wrong to be angry that day. She was angry at exactly the right things, pointed at exactly the wrong person, and it took a walk-in cooler, a clipboard I wasn't really using, and 4 minutes I've thought about almost every day since, to finally set the record straight. I think, too, about Renata, and about how strange it is that the exact system she designed to protect the truth of my restaurants was, decades later, the same system a dishonest man used to hide a lie about me. I don't think that I think it means that any system, however well designed, still requires someone willing to keep checking it, keep testing it, keep making sure the truth it's protecting hasn't quietly been replaced by something false while nobody was paying close enough attention. I check considerably more closely now than I did before that March afternoon. Every regional operator across all 12 locations now has their books audited by an outside firm annually, a policy I put in place within a month of Curtis's arrest, not because I've stopped trusting people generally, but because I've learned, the hard way, exactly how long a convincing lie can survive when nobody's specifically looking for it. Danielle and I have talked, more than once since that dinner, about the specific strangeness of her situation, working, unknowingly, inside her own future father-in-law's company for 3 years, forming an entire understanding of ownership that turned out to be a fiction built by someone else entirely. She told me a few months ago that she still sometimes catches herself, in meetings, almost apologizing before delivering difficult budget news, a reflex left over from 3 years of believing the owner was someone to be managed around rather than someone genuinely trying to run a fair, functional business. I told her I hoped that reflex would fade with time, and she told me it already had, considerably, in the months since she'd started running her own region with the specific, transparent honesty she'd once wished someone had shown her. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. I've told a lot of stories about my restaurants over the years, mostly to my own family, mostly small, ordinary anecdotes about difficult shifts and good ones. This is the first one I've ever told about the exact moment I understood how much a business can quietly drift from the values it was built on, and how much work it takes to drag it back. Thanks for being here. For real.